We've heard a lot of food for thought there, and Nick, I wanted to come to you first. Over and over again, the media asks the British public how they feel about hanging, and they seem to be in favour of it. What makes you think we're going to get a more sensible response by asking the public what they want from driverless technology?
Thanks, Steve. That's a really good question. I've seen some good survey data recently, and people aren't that persuaded by the potential benefits, that across the industry we believe to be there over what the introduction of automated vehicles might bring. They are not, on the whole, persuaded. But I also believe, in the trials that I've run of these vehicles, it doesn't take much for people to be persuaded of the benefits when they experience them, when they understand why the vehicles are being introduced, when they understand all of the good work that is being done to ensure their safety. I think they can be persuaded and do see the benefits quite quickly. And when they experience them and can see, it saves me time, it seems to do what I expect it to, it actually becomes a very mundane experience, and people are actually much more positive. So I think it depends how you frame the question. And I know the CCAV are doing a lot of work to explore this topic and understand how they can promote the discussion around what the benefits of automated vehicles might be. Okay, thanks very much. And as a Reece Jeffries trustee, we're all eagerly looking forward to the results of your work early next year. I'm going to pose a question.
Could I sort of chip in a bit on what Nick was saying there, because I think it goes really to what we mean by autonomous vehicles. So I know I wrote a paper some time ago that argued that an ABS system was an autonomous vehicle. I get no choice about it. I'm pretty sure it's taken control of the steering and the braking and the acceleration in some cases in relation to these things. It's nowadays joined up with things that are looking at high-speed emergency braking based on things that are going. And what we're seeing here is autonomy being introduced into vehicles, and we speculated from a legal point of view. There is no option for me to be in control of my vehicle whilst it's doing this. It's already taken those kinds of things. And I know some of the observations that came out of when we had the terrorist incident on Westminster Bridge, was the public were all for an autonomous capability that basically said you can't drive beyond the first person. So they're very fickle. So based on what was in the press last week, then we'll be all for that. But if that then resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, because this was now acting inappropriately, braking in the wrong places, they would change their mind immediately. And you can't build industries based on things that change that quickly. We've got to get stability about these sorts of views. So it's not got to be this fickle view. And the other thing that I know that we've discussed, so safety is a very important thing. It's particularly important to me if I'm standing in front of a vehicle, as it were. But most of the autonomous systems that I'm doing are to do with saving energy. If you look at the trains that are that they're doing in Germany, it's to do with saving energy. We have targets to save energy. So what if you did have a situation where 3 or 4 extra people were killed in the UK every year, but we needed 20% less energy? Presumably we think, because people keep telling me how much it's going to kill, that we have the current power things that we did. So I think there's a much more nuanced dialogue that needs to take place about these things and the ethics that go with it. It can't just, and I think that's what came out of the Law Commission stuff. It can't just be this simple, here or here type of thing in relation to that.
If I can come in on that as well, because I was having discussions with our colleagues at the UNECE level as well, and international vehicle standards, and they were telling us about some of the new driver assistance safety features that are being introduced and discussed for vehicles. And much as you're saying, this dividing line between things that are self-driving and just driver assistance is blurring significantly. It's not just braking. They were telling us about risk mitigation functions, which mean that if a driver becomes unavailable, you know, if someone perhaps has a medical condition that kicks in, vehicles are now features that are considered to be driver assistance, so not on the self-driving bit of the spectrum, might be able to notice that and actually bring the vehicle out of an active lane. And actually change lane to safety. And that has not been part of the conversations about self-driving. That has been seen as emergency type features that, you know, reduce the risks for us. And it's great that these conversations are happening. But there seems to be at some level a bit of silo thinking in terms of, you have the groups that focus on self-driving and they talk about automated lane keeping, which now will also change lane. So that title is no longer so appropriate from January 23. The automated lane keeping systems will actually change lane. But even things that are not classified as self-driving and are just, as you say, they're just classed as features that you can have on a vehicle that you very much drive, might do a lot more than they had in the past. So I think it's a very live conversation.
Well, absolutely. And so I'd want to come to you next, Jessica, because I want to follow up this point about trade-offs, which is, I mean, you put it very starkly there, Peter, the idea that we might be able to stay within our sixth carbon budget by killing a few people, if I paraphrase. But elsewhere in this picture, we're actually seeing an ambition that, something you said, Nick, that nobody should suffer, let's put it that way. So there could be benefits, and that's great. So fewer people might suffer injuries whilst they're in cars, but we don't want other people being killed as a consequence. Is this not a sort of a similar issue here, that okay, we could save lots of energy, a few people might die? Well, actually no, because we're not prepared to accept that. Is that, in your study, did you pick up anything that actually went beyond the benefits that accrue within transport to the energy world that Peter's wrestling with?
But I think the question, and Nick looked at this in much more detail, because the ethical aspect, we are talking here about ethics rather than just straight legal rules. I think Nick can speak much more to those aspects than I can. But what I can say, when we were considering, as part of the questions for rules for self-driving, for example, the fact we were told that pedestrians, where you can see their leg movement, for certain systems, it might be much easier to pick those up than persons that might be wearing long skirts, for example. And that could have religious connotations as well, different dress and aspects that are even protected characteristics, which by law, you are not allowed to discriminate against. So quite apart from what any of us would desire, there are some clear legal rules about not bringing out worse outcomes for protected characteristics. So with those aspects, the way that we thought about it was, you certainly are not in a position to make things worse for anyone. Any system, any technology that resulted in worse outcomes for certainly protected characteristics, that's already the law. But we might, as a society, think that that should be true of any category, however you cut it. No one should be worse off. But then the benefits might be more for certain groups just because of the nature of the technology. That is not something that is necessarily desirable. It might just be a practical reality of the way the technology is developing, and we need to be transparent about it. And I think we need to have information about, you know, the benefits and who exactly they accrue to, so that they can be assessed and people can make their own judgments. But, you know, the trade-offs in terms of saving energy versus road deaths, I think no one should be playing God about saying, well, then this is worth more, this life is worth more than that life, or this interest should be more than that one. These are political questions, and they would need to be addressed certainly at a democratic, you know, political level versus any interpretation of our current laws. I think that would be ridiculous. Even things like looking at our birth rates, you know, obviously a big way in which one could reduce consumption is by having less population, but that would be incredibly, unsavory, to talk about in terms of policies to actually push. And everyone's talking about actually encouraging immigration or encouraging people to have kids. So these are just political, hot potatoes. But I don't know, Nick, you probably want to say
I was going to come back to you, Nick.
Throwing me a hot potato.
But I'm not sure birth control came up in your work so far, but on this question of trade-offs.
Oh, absolutely, and that's you know, in this process, we're aiming for vision zero, aiming for net zero. There are trade-offs in all these aspects. I think the important point to remember here, I think, is it's not about the vehicles making ethical decisions. It's about the system in which those vehicles have been created and permitted to operate. That is where the ethics lies. And the more we understand about how these vehicles will be deployed, what benefits they may or may not be able to achieve, the better we can make those decisions, the more ethical we can be about how those vehicles should be deployed. I think actually one of the really nice pieces of work over the last few years has been the Future of Mobility Urban Strategy, I think it was called. The 9 principles that came out in that DFT document about you know, the need for any new transport solutions to be focused on sustainability, to not increase harm, to be shared, to not affect active travel. I think, you know, those kind of principles encapsulated a lot of the things I think people would think of as was an ethical evolution of the transport system.
Okay. Now, I'm conscious we've got very little time before we're going to be interrupted, so I don't want to ask a long question. We're going to come back to the question of data, because to some extent you've all raised it, and there are some things I particularly want to pick up. But I was going to come back to you, Jessica, not specifically on the issue of feline harm, but you've talked about a degree of stability legally, if I put it that way. I think we've had 3 changes to the highway code in the last year. Are we seeking after something that practically in the real world isn't going to be deliverable in much the same way as public opinion moves on? You know, can we have that stability, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't advocating that we should be stopping rule changes. I was actually more highlighting the fact that we need to change our approach to thinking about how we comply and being agile and ready to respond to it. Often people, you know, don't really read the highway code, you know, beyond shock horror. But, you know, it requires, you know, the news, putting out changes, but otherwise people, they just get on with their lives. You know, they've been driving, they hear things from friends, or you know, God forbid they actually get you know, maybe stopped by enforcement officer. But the idea is for self-driving, it's not a case of passing a test at one point in time and then the vehicle being good to go forever. It's obviously going to have to be reassessed at different points, but it's not enough to just have certain junctures, you know, every year or however you decide, because rule changes are more agile than that and they change more frequently than that. And so we need to be able to ensure that those rule changes are reflected appropriately by these systems, and we just need mechanisms to make that happen. But I agree, it's not possible to achieve stability. Indeed, we need our laws to reflect our agile and moving society, who is changing, possibly also in its attitude to cats, as I hope, but you know.
So probably the last question before we skip to Trent, but I'm going to come to you on this one, Peter, because I'm intrigued, and it is a data question, but it goes beyond that. We've talked about the rules and laws, and I'm quite familiar with a lot of the rules and laws that apply in the UK, much less so with the whole of the rest of the world. You're working in an international environment. Are we actually chasing after something here that's genuinely deliverable? We don't even have a single national type approval system for cars, let alone standardization. We have a system where France accepts double the fatality rate from road accidents that we do. Are we talking about a set of rules that genuinely can be created that applies globally, or is it going to work if we have something that's more domestically contrived?
So I don't think, so firstly, I don't think if we continue to do what we're doing that we are chasing after something that's achievable. We are undervaluing things that have mattered in our systems.
Such as?
So just as an example, we talk about the problem with the driver, but actually for me the driver is really fundamental to the robustness and safety of our road system. They all behave differently, even though they all went through the same test. And if you compare that to a digital system where we've done verification to make sure they're all the same, that isn't the same at all. So the failure mode on people approaching junctions, well, yes, you can get bad junctions, but people react differently, so you don't get suddenly everything goes wrong. So when you get these changes over time, and And let's remember, we did a study where we used a cybersecurity person who was not a cybersecurity person. They came from marine biology. Mm-hmm. They succeeded in generating one new cyber attack every 10 seconds. Yeah, I have no system that can react that kind of way. And if our intention is we'll make it all the same, then it better be robust against all of those. And I don't think it is, and I don't think we know any way to do that. So this aspect that, people have actually been very valuable. If you look at why do our digital vehicles at the moment not all fail at the same time, it's because people mop up the problems with our digital systems. Mm-hmm. That isn't the true when you go it isn't true when you go for things that are driven by the digital system. Yeah, and it was interesting listening to the way that you were talking about this and the way we were talking about these things. Yeah, you talk about it as though it's still an analog system. Yeah, and having done these studies, you sort of basically go down through these things. The only bit that matters to me is the bit where the rubber hits the road, as it were, where we brake. It's that bit, and I somehow have to line up a digital system with that. And digital systems fail one bit at a time. We know all this from the science, so we know we can't do what we're trying to do. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. What it means is you have to reimagine what you're doing. You have to look at how you're going to achieve that. You have to start to introduce diversity into the system where you've taken it out. And you have to make sure that's economically viable, because otherwise we won't get the right outcome.
Christian and I have got less confident rather than more in the last 2 minutes from what you just said there. Tell me why I'm getting that wrong, because what I'm hearing here is, it just feels to me like an impossibly hard task, even if all we were doing was doing something in London, let alone the UK, and yet we're trying to do this on a global stage where a whole bunch of companies, particularly in the States, which hopefully we're going to hear about any second now, are cracking on with. So.
And I agree, you can crack on with it. It's the failure mode, as I said. The failure mode of digital systems is global. So when you say, is it acceptable? Yeah. So I get a better outcome. Your issue is in 5 minutes' time, in 10 minutes' time, in a year's time, suddenly you have a global failure. And the global failure is not necessarily a safety one. Just imagine what would happen if all the vehicles stopped. We wouldn't have fuel, we wouldn't have emergency services, we wouldn't have food. And actually I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have water and power either.
I'm going to start us back on this challenge of how do we contrive a system that is in some sense mimicking the responsible human driver. And I'm going to start with just a show of hands, who has a driving license in here today? That looked like almost, if not absolutely everybody. There's a question I like to ask on these occasions, which if the person next to you put their hand up, then could you put your hand up now if you think that they are a better than average driver? Okay, it's about 6 or 7 of you. Now, sometimes I ask the question of who thinks they are a better than average driver. I'm not going to ask you that, because we all know we're better than average drivers, don't we, Jessica? And yet, somehow, the law on speed limits in this country really couldn't be much clearer, could it? And yet, many people, I mention no names, seem to think they're advisory, not mandatory. How on earth, in that world where we actually live, can we be talking about the averagely responsible driver when we're trying to work out what the system, the driverless system, will do?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's not an easy one. There's no easy answers to it, but I really liked seeing in Trent's example when he was showing the different types of average drivers that you could be. So there's an average driver involved in a fatal collision, and then you've got the average human driver, and then you might have someone that has extra skills, and that is actually, with potentially even extra training that is involved. And there's actually been a change in legislation to recognize, for example, police officers were lobbying for this, that if you've been for a driving course, then your behavior should be assessed to that higher standard. What's safe for a police officer in a chase to do is not the same as it would be for someone else. So there's definitely a strong variability there that we just need to work with. And I think it is about, as you say, comparing apples with apples and trying to, when we say average driver, that's just not enough. We need a lot more to it. And I think what I was also mentioning when we talked about this issue within the Law Commission consultations, the fact that different things will be challenging for the systems compared to our human drivers. And how do we acknowledge that? You know, we say we want them to be better than the careful and competent driver, but we have also acknowledged that they're absolutely not the same and that they will have different flaws. Lots of great things about them, and I'm sure the Waymo driver, as I know they like to refer to it, is incredibly skilled and drives very well, but it will have challenges in places where you know, the average human driver on actually pretty much any bit of the scale would actually find it pretty easy to tell whether they're dealing with leaves versus some other aspect that makes them feel less confident about moving forward. So I think it's about using a range of different metrics, and I think we need more precision and more transparency about the aspects where we actually do not have a common terminology or a common understanding, and building that common understanding.
Well, I was intrigued by the video that we saw there, that I wonder what the outcome would have been if the Waymo driver had been the innocent party trying to cross the junction, and the human who caused the crash was still, sometime in the next 10 to 15 years, probably going to be driving a human-controlled car, but we didn't see that. Perhaps we can invite Trent back and we'll run through that one next time round. Now, unless there's an immediate question from you guys, I want to go on to the issue of data. And I'm going to pose the question for all of you to have a go at here. My starting point is this. As of today, if there is a crash on the road and the police are investigating it, they have powers to get data. And they don't, quite often, from the auto manufacturer because it's too hard. They think it's too hard. They can't get it in a form that they can readily interrogate to help them with their investigation. Or, and again, I mention no names, some auto companies suddenly find that they don't seem to have that data anymore. Extraordinary. We know when the boot has been opened in a Land Rover 7 years ago, because that way we managed to prosecute a chap who was a murderer. And yet somehow this other data goes missing. How on earth? You said we need data, but are we going to get it? And are we going to get it in a form where those who need access to it will get it in the form they need? And I'm going to start with you, Nick, because you're looking anxious to get in on this one.
I think it's the entry fee. To be able to deploy these vehicles is to have the process that gives confidence to regulators, to the public, that the vehicles are operating safely, and you can evidence that that is indeed the case. And I think it's incumbent on all of the organisations represented here today to work together on formulating what that process should be, making sure it's fair, allows innovation to happen, but also that it does give that confidence. And it might be overly onerous to begin with, but I think in the absence of statistical evidence on their safety, I think we need an onerous process to give that confidence that they do indeed operate at that competent and careful level.
But before I come to the others, so we could have an onerous process, and that's sort of fine, an onerous process in terms of the obligations on the companies. But what about that part of the process is, if you like, the regulator? If you haven't got the regulator, if you haven't got somebody or something that's receiving that data, interrogating it, and providing that public confidence, you haven't really got a system, and yet we don't have that.
I think we're getting that. I think we're on our way to that. I think there's a recognition that technical capability, those skills, need to be part of the future of road safety in the UK if we're going to have these vehicles on our roads. And if we believe there are benefits to be gained from doing so, then we need to have that in place. Yeah, it will take more technical capability. It will take more, a different skill set. I think the Road Safety Investigation Branch have a role in this as well. It's coming. Will it happen in a timely way? It's always a challenge, isn't it? But I think the recognition is there that things need to change in how we collect, analyse, and process data related to safety.
So the capability is coming. I'm going to come to you next, Jessica, because in the law commissions, you're always wrestling with the fact of we would like a nice, clear legal obligation, and we'd quite like people to observe it. So this is a classic case of that, but having some sort of regulatory body was part of your thinking. How does that fit into this data picture?
Well, everyone's always asking about data, and in terms of identifying minimum data sets that would be shared, that's like an absolute precondition, and I agree with Nick, it's sort of the entry fee, like we suggest it should be a licensed activity, so in order to become a licensed entity, you would have to buy into the fact of sharing this data. The thing that we have found to be really challenging from a legal perspective, and I've noticed this if you look at any of the regulations that delve into this area, even at a UN level, European level, is a really difficult balance of privacy. Because anything that involves personally identifiable data suddenly, sends shockwaves through people, and they're like, well, I'm not so comfortable actually with that kind of data being shared. And so, whereas it's easier to think about the obligations that we put on companies to share data, it does actually affect all of us, passengers, other road users, and the extent to which we balance the comfort level we might have with data that, that might personally identify you in some shape or form, sort of being available. It's a big trade-off, because when we were looking certainly at the approaches of the European Commission to this question, they talk about anonymized data sets being shared. So even the end of your VIN number would always be taken away from any data that is collected. But if you take that approach, that helps you in no way for incident investigation. And you want to know where that vehicle was. You want to know things about it to be able to tell whether it behaved in the way that you expected or not. So although generic statistics have some value, you also want to be able to hold people accountable and use that data in a very specific way. Even though it's not punitive, it still needs to be quite precise. So I think finding that balance, and at the moment, my impression is that at international level, people have decided to opt towards the aspect of going away from this issue and putting privacy at the forefront when it comes to data, at the expense of putting in place systems which can actually maybe lead to better use of data to improve safety. But it's just because of how sensitive the topic is that we're kind of going in that direction, and they leave it more to local decision making to say, hey, we're actually happy to have location data, for example. You'd think that's pretty basic. If you have a self-driving vehicle out there involved in a collision, at the moment, the minimum data set that is required in the DSSAD, the Driving Automation Systems black box, if you will, does not include location. So we wouldn't have that information of a timestamp for when the collision happened in some of the key events, but not where it is. So part of our consultation was to say, from a GB perspective, we definitely expect location data to be there. So if there was a hit and run or there was some sort of issue, the police and other enforcers would have the ability to work with data sets to try and identify what had gone wrong. But that's just one very basic example where you see tensions in what we might be able to collect. And very rightful, and I'm not dismissing the privacy concerns by any stretch. I'm very in favor of having that dialogue. It's just that it can't be all or nothing. We really do need more data and more information, and that is not your conventional balance, if you will.
So before I come to you, Peter, on this, I just want to push on that trade-off briefly with you, Jessica, because it's long struck me that I think it's interesting. If I asked anyone in this audience today, would you be in favour of, on balance, putting primacy on the data privacy side of the equation or on improved road safety for you and your family? I suspect most of us would vote for the road safety. If that meant I, the regulatory authority, knew when you broke the speed limit, in the unlikely event that any of you did, I just wonder whether that's fueling some of this kind of sort of anxiety, shall we say, about data privacy. I mean, is it not time we just knocked that one down and said, actually, no, it's not. You're on the public road. This is not a private space. What you do in your own bedroom, that's your private space. Probably don't drive your car there. But if you're on the public road, no, we know who you are, we know how fast you're going, and if there's a crash, we're going to know what happened. Isn't it time we went down that path?
There's definitely a strong argument that way. I think one of the big challenges is that these vehicles are collecting a lot of data. It's not necessarily just the basic data that you were saying. It's like, for example, if there's any video type evidence, photographic evidence, it can then get much more layered and textured. And I think the comfort levels, depending, what exactly were you doing in the car, for example, and you might feel like it's fine that, if you were breaking the speed limit, but if, you were in the vehicle and, you're watching like something, your kids were in the back, watching a video or whatever might be going on in the vehicle, if there was more emphasis on that or where you were going, exactly, those things I think people are less comfortable with, and rightly so. I mean, it's a conversation, it's not a given. So whereas if I think the interface is with rule breaking, I think most of us would agree, but for anything beyond that, I think it's a much more difficult question. And then the classic is that often the value of data, you collect it for one purpose, but then it becomes valuable for a different purpose. And there's obviously a strong data protection laws that are quite specific about what you collect data for and what you can use it for, but then the trust levels of us as individuals about that actually being complied with are an entirely separate matter, because we all know that although rules exist, they're not always complied with. Certainly also even big corporates are found to be in breach of some of their obligations. So there's a level of trust of the system. And once you've given data out and it's out there, you can't recapture it. So I think that's where some of the difficulties are legitimate, if you will.
Okay, so Peter, we were going to come to you. We are with you. You said we need data. Is it going to come? Is it going to be an entry fee that the industry globally accepts? And are we going to have a system in place that can actually engage with that data? What's your degree of confidence in all of that?
So clearly, as Jessica said, we collect an enormous amount of data. But I think that fits, for me, that always fits into several different categories. So the first interesting thing is, when you look at accidents, you're doing forensics in relation to that. So it was interesting the way that people use things like the airbag controllers and things of that nature, which is not the purpose of them, but it was giving things that gave you additional information. But one of the things I always observe in relation to that, generally speaking, that data is useful because it's working against the analog system. So you actually go through these things in a row. When you're actually working, and there's a different set of data, which is often what people are talking about on their autonomy systems, where they're actually talking about this pure digital model of what things are doing in relation to that. So could it do this kind of stuff is a much more, that's more akin to I'm asking the questions on the basis of the near misses on things that might happen, as opposed to things that have happened. So what you could draw conclusions from, and you saw it on the Waymo conclusions there in relation to that, there's that tension between, well, have you looked at all the circumstances? Have you done all of those things? There are completely different things that would have required completely different data. And it's why I put up the gate, because we tend to create these circular things where it's like, I've got this data and it will allow me to show these things. Whereas the way data has evolved, and the way data has evolved in accidentology, is we have these bits here, and it's turned out that these pieces are useful in being able to assess those things, and we can make improvements before it. Often the things that we've looked at have turned out to be much less useful. And if I look at the stuff you do on aircraft with the black boxes, if I look at how we've used this proliferation of processors on vehicles in order to get those things, that data and how we might want to use it, how we have to go back to the courts to be allowed to use it for this purpose. So we've certainly got to a point where we know how to ask for that in relation to retrospective forensics. We have not got to a point where we know how to ask for things that we don't know, just in order to establish what may or may not happen. And I think the other area I'd like to tease out is there's a huge difference now between what we did. So all of this stuff is talking about data that is on the vehicle. But much of what's happening around your autonomous system is to do with the training data sets that are not on your vehicle. They don't exist in the UK, for instance. They're in somewhere down your supply chain. They're just not there. And even if they were, we don't seem to have a mechanism yet for understanding how an AI system works and how that actually gets to its conclusion. So the whole reason we use AI is because we didn't know how to program it to do that. So we left it to learn how to do it himself. So that bit about trustworthy and how you got to those sorts of things, we don't know what data, we don't know what those things are proving, and they're not actually on the platform, they're not necessarily even in the OEM, they may be way back on the supply chain. And I know that when people think about this, they think about this always in terms of the top-level autonomy system. But what about the machine learning that sits in a chip, in a sensor or something of this nature, which is equally valid? So you've got these things happening in pools all over the place. And there isn't a clear way you can put those things together, or that you could say, this is the data set that I need, which is why it's been so much easier to be able to go for this for retrospective, and so much harder to try and legislate for these are the things that I'm going to need, and these are the things I'm going to standardise. And one of the things I guess I would try and draw to people's attention, often when you standardise, what you're saying is, this is what you'll collect. And then all the things to do with privacy and they kick in around that. So you've made exceptions for those sorts of things. That is then going to limit what you can do, at a stage where we're very early on in actually being able to do those things. So your pretty extreme risk is that you're getting to a situation where you'll say it's only this type of data that we'll ever be able to look at, because that's what we then put into regulations. And because they're going to have to be worldwide regulations, that's going to take so much time and so much effort to do, it will not be responsive.
I'm in danger of having a sort of Jeremy Paxman-like moment here of pressing you. Are you suggesting, therefore, that what we need Jessica to be recommending is a power to require whatever we want, whenever we want it, whatever it is, even though we don't know what it is yet, and that the industry will say, yep, fair enough?
No, I'm certain the industry won't say fair enough. But actually, what I'm suggesting is, in many cases, the more interesting data has turned out to be the things where people have used things in ways they weren't expecting. Nobody designed an airbag controller expecting it would be of phenomenal use to the police when they were doing accident investigations, but it is. And then we've had to address, when are you able to ask for that? What are you able to do with those sorts of things? And it's the correlation between these things. It's the correlation between what independent, so what gives you information in forensics is a pattern of life. Trying to legislate for a pattern of life is incredibly difficult to do. So it's not like I'm saying they'll go, yeah. They are already collecting those things. What you need to start discussing is what are the near-miss conditions? What are those that are not already covered by we've already had the accident? That will allow you to do, that we wish to actually engage in and have that dialogue.
No, absolutely. I absolutely get what you're saying there, because quite apart from whether we're talking about driverless or autonomous technologies, we are increasingly, I think, interested in lead factors rather than lag factors when it comes to road safety. We want to know about the accident that nearly happened, so it doesn't ever happen, as opposed to being fixated on things that have gone wrong and interrogating why they went wrong when those circumstances might never actually replicate themselves later.
So I think the other thing you need to bring is the ethics aspect of this thing, and I know Jessica and I think, discussed this years ago. So we always talk about the accident bit. The mode of failure that you're talking about in relation, for digital systems, for if I do a cyber attack in relation to these things, the idea that I could stop, every car of a particular model, not because I stopped it, but because its safety system stopped it. It did what it was supposed to do. It's not an incorrect thing, but the consequence for society of every Ford parked up or every JLR parked up, on the M25 would be indistinguishable from normal, I know, but the consequence for society of actually parking up on all of this is we don't move food, we don't move all. These are serious things that we're dealing with as outcomes, and it's because you're now looking at not the one thing, and I know it's one of the areas that the law struggles to deal with. There's the individual case as opposed to the general case that goes with these sorts of things, and there isn't a way. So it's not that it's definitely right because of these things. That, I think, is the area that we have to get around from an ethics point of view. I have to program systems. So the risk that Waymo are taking is that they create a system that it's not unsafe inherently. Indeed, they may all stop across junctions, or they may stop somewhere and they will be safe, but they may stop San Francisco functioning. That is the risk you're taking there.
Well, we all saw in the video of Phoenix that apparently there are no cats, but apparently they have cyclists, which I didn't realise. But Jessica, when we think about these things and when we think about the law, when you were thinking about them for the study that the law commissions did your thinking stretch beyond the obligations to the fact that the framework actually needs an intelligent regulatory customer for compliance with those regulations? I mean, where do you think the government, where the department stands on that now, given that they accepted your recommendations? Are we seeing that as something that's going to be developed?
I think so. My impression in terms of the balance, it's always, as you were saying, the balance between certainty and leaving enough flexibility. So you don't want to have just a generic power that gives no guidance about how it's going to be used. But on the other hand, you also need to have enough precision so that people know what they're coming up against. And the law deals with this all the time, like in a traditional way. You've got the common law, which tended to be more black and white, and then you had equity, the court of equity that stepped in when it produced an unfair result. Equity would trump the straight legal obligation. We still have that now. It's part of our legal system. And we always basically give precedence to the equitable obligation. So that's how those tensions are resolved systemically from a legal perspective. But for the regulatory scheme, the way that, the balance that we sought to strike was by emphasizing the powers and the agility of regulators, to be fair, in it being able to adapt what they might need over time. And of course, there will need to be clear communication with the companies and the stakeholders involved, but you cannot ossify and be too prescriptive at the get-go about what you'll be requiring. So for example, on data, we suggested that the data that has to be shared from, like the legal obligation we suggested on those that are putting self-driving vehicles onto the roads, is to share such data that insurers might need to resolve claims in a fair and equitable way. That's an outcome-based requirement. We didn't say you need to give specific data sets. They might vary a lot over time. We were specific about location because we were certain enough about that data element that it would be needed, but we didn't go further than that. There's so much more that can be done, but the utility of, for example, CCTV in vehicles, if a passenger is having a medical emergency or things like that, of course they will be useful and they will need to be utilized. But the extent to which that needs to be shared or used is something that we are not prescribing right now, and we're leaving it to an outcome-based standard of what it is that is required at any particular time. And that's going to involve codes of practice. That's going to involve learning together about what it is that we can actually put out there and work with.
Thank you very much. Well, look, I've definitely seen the first hand go up in the audience. So if you do have questions this morning or this afternoon, when the microphone comes to you, if you could say who you are, but in the first instance, I know who you are, because you're Christian Warnwell. So Christian, I hope you've got the mic there, and the question for the panel.
Yeah, Christian Warnwell, I'm the resident skeptic, I think. And I've written a book called Driverless Cars on the Road to Nowhere a couple of years ago. And I mentioned that because when I wrote it a couple of years ago, I went to several conferences where there were real evangelists for driverless cars, and we'd have debates. I think Nick was at one of them. And they were presenting a world where we would all have our lives changed by this invention. We would be in driverless cars, our grandparents would be able to get to hospital in cars without kind of any problem, even though they were suffering from dementia. Our kids could be taken to school. We'd all be in shared use electric driverless cars by 2025 or something. And I just wonder, I suppose particularly Nick, but also the rest of you, whether that world is still being presented or still being seen as being feasible. And a couple of problems that I cited in my book, which Jessica mentioned one of them, which I call the Holborn problem, which is the pedestrians in Holborn at 6 o'clock in the evening. You actually put a picture that was very similar to that. I still have seen no potential resolution for that. Either you drive, push past and kill somebody, or push past them, or you don't and you get stuck forever. And there are several issues like that I see as pretty insuperable to the vision that has been actually presented. The fun one, and I'll just leave it on that, the fun one is what you do down a country lane in Somerset where there's only a single lane and two driverless cars meet each other. Do they stay there forever? How do they decide which one reverses or gets out of the way or whatever? And there are about a dozen questions like that. And I just wonder where we are with this vision.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start by just observing that were he here and not in Stockholm, I suspect Trent will be part of the Glee Club.
I was hoping to ask him a lot of these questions.
And we've suggested to the organisers that might happen one day. But in the meantime, particularly that main question that Christian poses to us, because many of us, including myself, found ourselves in those very debates just a couple of years ago, and it all felt like it was all going to be happening. Have we seen that world ebbing away, the confidence ebbing away? Or if Grant were here, he'd be saying, but no, we're already running services, and I've shown you how the vehicle can make its way through the crowded streets of San Francisco. So let's start with you on that one, Nick.
I think you've summed the balance up there perfectly. Yeah, there was certainly a hype bubble. There were certainly organisations that were carried away with that and made promises that haven't come to pass. And I'm very glad Christian has a book from his scepticism and has sold some books from that. But I think my focus is we still have the plateau of fatalities. And this technology, I think, has the potential to change that fundamentally.
This is the plateau of deaths on the roads due to crashes and other incidents from the cars and traffic we have now.
Indeed, indeed. And both through the development of the technology to improve driver assistance systems, but also ultimately moving towards that automated future, not everywhere all the time. I don't think anyone of us will be alive when you are compelled only to use automated vehicles on the road. I can't see that happening. I think it's part of a push towards greater sustainability, more use of active travel, so it has to be compatible with that. And just on one of the challenge situations Christian identified, one of my fellow Rhys Jeffries funding winners, Eloy, are here in the audience and have a solution for that exact problem that works both for human-driven and automated vehicles. So we are knocking down these challenges one at a time. It's not by 2025 or whatever was promised 5 years ago, but in certain situations, it's happening. The constraints on that will broaden over time, as long as it's with the agreement, the support of society, and I'm keen that happens.
Thank you, Nick. So I'm juggling three things here because two hands went up. There's a screen down here that most of you can't see that says you have 27 seconds left of your time allotted, and two more people to answer Christian's question. So what I'm going to do is say very briefly, could you give me your view on Christian's point there? Has that enthusiasm of 2 years ago proven to be over-enthusiasm or even more than that? Yes or no? What do you reckon, Peter?
So I think the idea that it'll go everywhere was over-enthusiasm. It was always like to be. I think the looking for where you're going to use these things, so the fact you might use things in agriculture, the fact you might use things in mines, perfectly sensible. The fact you might want to use stuff in a nuclear power station where you'd otherwise harm people. These are all perfectly sensible places where you'll deploy the technology and it'll get out there.
In deployment at Sizewell, perhaps a bit longer to get to Somerset. Jessica?
I think I'm all for enthusiasm in general. I think it helps things move forward. I think it just then needs to have the right challenge. But I think it's natural that those that are bringing something that is different and changing would be showing the full potential benefit. Unfortunately, our world is far from perfect, so it will never, nothing that we ever put forward will be quite an idealistic state. But I think it can help to paint the picture of what we're striving for, even 0 fatalities on our roads. It's very hard to imagine that that would be possible, but you do need to have that ambition in order to motivate people and show them what direction we're going. So I think if it's taken with that spirit, I think there's nothing wrong with that enthusiasm, but it needs to be mitigated with real actions behind it, and then having proper accountability and debate to then talk it through and see how we can get to that imperfect future, but still having the drive to move forward and have those really good debates and the great challenges we need to have more of.
And if I may, I would just add, I don't think the enthusiasm has dimmed. I think some of the optimism has been shown to be over-optimism, and I think it's been put alongside a growing sense of what you've been hearing here all morning, which is a growing sense of, well, what are the challenges and questions that are going to have to be overcome if the benefits that the enthusiasts are telling us are achievable will come. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our two questioners. So I saw your hand go up, sir, and I saw your hand. We're going to take both questions rather than one at a time. So we'll take both questions, and then we'll get the panel to respond, and then we're going to break for lunch. So who's got the microphone? You have. Right, OK, so over here first and then over there.
Thank you. I'm John Emanuel. I'm CTO of Urban Mass Limited, which is making tracked vehicles for mass transit. I've been listening with huge interest because we're using autonomous vehicles on tracks. And it strikes me that the ambitions of a global system for cars, where Jessica said, my car takes me to Dover, and when I get to Calais, it's got to be reprogrammed because the rules are going to be different. I think that seems very, very ambitious. I also noted that Waymo are using their system in a limited place like Phoenix or San Francisco. So I have two questions, really. One is there are relatively low-hanging fruit in this area, like taxi services, where if you can save the cost of the driver, it's a real benefit. Tracked systems, another, or segregated ways is another low-hanging fruit, where automation and autonomy would be much more interesting. So I have two questions. What are the low-hanging fruit? Because I like driving my car, most of the time. Most of the time I don't want to sit in the back. But going in a taxi, I can see as low-hanging fruit. Tracked systems, I see as low-hanging fruit. Limited cities. Where are the low-hanging fruit? And can we go from low-hanging fruit to a more general system over the decades?
Okay, thank you very much. And if the microphone could go up to here.
You're welcome. Shall I ask my question now? Yeah. So my question is, I'm Nigel Wall from Shadow Creek Consulting, and I'm very interested in sharing data. And I think the critical stage we need is to maximize safety. And then there's a conflict between competition and cooperation. Waymo obviously investing huge amounts of money in there. Let's say Argo is still around and not investing as much. The situation has largely been described about when there's an accident, that there will be reports and data will be shared. But you made the point, Peter, that Waymo will be detecting incidents where there was a near miss, and then they'll be applying that to their shared learning within their system. To make this system across the board as safe as possible, we need that kind of learning. That's very, very smart learning. It's not there was an accident, but they detected a cause, and we need that to be shared. I don't think we can expect the AI system to be so explainable that we can say, this is the process we used, but I think perhaps we could have the scenario, and somehow there needs to be some programming data set that all vehicles have to be trained against, and it's added to that. So this risk that wasn't recognized before is now recognized and put into a common data set. So that's actually, Waymo would be giving away a lot of their knowledge. Each time there was a near miss, they'd be sharing that. But it seems to me if we don't share this data, then you're going to have some vehicles which are way behind, cause accidents, and the whole thing could be scrapped because of, poor performing vehicles.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is come to you, Peter, I'm afraid, specifically on this issue that it's all very well for one company to have data relating to a near miss, but if that data isn't shared across the industry, we're going to miss out on the collective need to tackle that issue. So is there a barrier to that happening? Is that part of the open data revolution that you're contemplating here, that would just happen as a matter of course?
I think there's a barrier to that happening, and I think it's the elephant in the room that we haven't spoken about. You know, if it's going to cost 5 times the price of a current vehicle for an autonomous vehicle because I've got to keep working on it the whole time. And I think one of the studies that we did on cybersecurity was, I think the industry reckoned they needed 500,000 cybersecurity professionals at 150k a year. That's unaffordable, you know, and they hadn't actually worked out what they needed on software engineers on these sorts of things. So what you're looking at fundamentally is how do you monetize, and data is what people are monetizing. It's there. So if you're then telling them you've got to give away what you're relying on to monetize and make this stuff happen, that's not going to happen.
That's a tough one.
And you've already seen this in the supply chain. Camera suppliers, they'll only turn on those features that have been paid for. You know, they're collecting way more than that sort of stuff. The people who are doing the right to repair stuff are putting elements on there that are using other people's data. That's a dispute at the moment about what they're allowed to use. This is one of the really hot things. And it's hot because if you can't find some way to monetize this, we won't do it anyway, because it'll just be prohibitively expensive.
And I mean, it takes us back to right at the beginning of what you were saying in your presentation about unless we have a commercial proposition here, we don't actually have a proposition.
Correct.
So, on that thought, very briefly, low-hanging fruit. Is there a proposition? Is it something that can readily be brought to market, or perhaps are some of the constraints and challenges we've been talking about for the more advanced systems actually going to stop the low-hanging fruit being harvested too? Nick?
Peter alluded to it already, the ports, the mining environments where there's control over the environment, I think represent a low-hanging fruit. And then, as I say, you expand the complexity of what you can achieve from there. I think there's a shift towards movement of goods. And in the Gateway project, we had the first supermarket delivery in partnership with Ocado, made by an automated vehicle. So yeah, I think that represents one of the forms of low-hanging fruit. And the other one would be the benefit to the user of the time saved in highway journeys, where the complexity of the journey, where the complexity of the environment is less than it is in Holborn or elsewhere.
But to be specific, the challenges and constraints we've been talking about, you don't think they're going to get in the way of that low-hanging fruit? I'm talking specifically on road here, so I can see why they wouldn't apply in a quarry, but I can equally well see why they would apply on High Holborn.
So I think 5, 6, 7 years ago, there was the assumption that because we're nearly there, you know, because we can make the vehicle move and detect its environment and operate safely to a limited extent, that we are very close to being able to do the very complicated environments. And I think that hasn't been the case. I think that challenge hasn't been overcome yet. It's getting there, as we saw in the videos from Waymo, but it will be a while before that is global and widespread.
Okay, thank you. Okay, briefly, low-hanging fruit?
So I agree. There's all these places where you can get low-hanging fruit, anywhere I can control the harm. So taxi services are interesting. So long as I've got 12 taxis, I can control the harm. There's only so much damage they can do. I can ensure that.
Oh, I think I disagree.
Excellent.
Well, there is only so much harm, I think. What I mean is I can't take that, though, to 1 million vehicles, because at that point, I have no... So you don't have a methodology here that allows you to do inherently safe stuff.
I just think that the word taxi and simple, just in the same sentence,
Yeah,
don't work
okay.
very well together.
I'll work on that, but I'll give it that Waymo have already got that. So,
So Jessica, are you telling us that the low-hanging fruit is shriveling before our eyes?
No, I remain on the enthusiastic note. I think it was interesting, you know, Phoenix is sunny, for example, as a jurisdiction, and, you know, in the US you have more grid system type roads. So, of course, those aspects are of assistance in some ways. But San Francisco, on the other hand, has like the most strange weather. I don't know if you've been as well. I was always a bit shocked, you know, at different times of year you've got mist and fog. So it's great that they're sort of experimenting there. And I think it shows, you know, the increasing capabilities. I mean, I have been in quite a few trials where, even around Oxford with Oxbotica, for example, and Wave and different companies like Five, where they have been in pretty densely urban environments, and you did have pedestrians sort of coming quite close, but the vehicle managed, you know, without the intervention of a safety driver. So I think there are ways, and of course we're hearing Nick's colleagues as well exploring these issues. So I think there is headway being made there. Low-hanging fruit, I agree with what Nick and Peter have said. I think simpler environments, but that is just infinitely variable. You know, can you control how many vulnerable road users there are? We were really careful, though, in our discussion of the topic. We were really keen on not introducing jaywalking laws, for example. We said that's not on the table, because of course it would make it easier. For example, if you prevented people from crossing at inconvenient or less predictable places, it would be pretty good, possibly, for the self-driving vehicle to have to deal with less of that uncertainty. We were very clear when we were looking at this topic that the vehicles have to be able to deal with the environment as they find it. We shouldn't be expecting humans to, you know, adjust their behavior massively just to enable this technology. If we want to introduce those laws, then absolutely, if we think it's the best thing for road safety, but it shouldn't be something about facilitating a technological development. But if we think it can improve things, absolutely, let's have the conversation.
And on that note, I would like to invite you to thank our panel for this morning.